Hello and welcome, everyone. Trying to see if this is working. It is working. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Hello and welcome, everyone. We are Alia, Devon, and Suneil, informally referred to as DNA in all Flaherty emails. We hope you enjoyed the films tonight and that you will come back for more tomorrow. Before we get started, we just wanted to take a moment to show some love for the Flaherty. Devon and I actually met at the seminar in 2019, and this was the beginning. And then we met up with Suneil after, and the whole thing started. So thank you to the Flaherty for giving us this opportunity to bring together these incredible artists and to share their work with you all. We would have obviously loved to have this in person, but I tell myself that if this was happening at Anthology from Archives like it usually does, we wouldn't have been able to have this great group here together. So on that note, I would like to invite our guests for tonight to join us. One more thing before I pass it on to Devon, I just want to say that we would really love for this to be an interactive conversation. So please type your questions to the artists and we are going to make sure they get them.
Before we begin, just want to have the artists introduce themselves. I'm Devon Narine-Singh. I'm one of the co-programmers for Flaherty NYC 2020 to 2021. It's been a pleasure working with Alia and Suneil on this program. And so for the filmmakers, if they could each just volunteer to introduce themselves, their film title, where they're based, and what time it is for them, as we have a very international audience, as Alia said before.
Bassem, do you want to start?
Hi, everyone. It's Bassem. I'm usually based in Beirut, but I'm currently in Berlin, and it's 3:30 a.m. But I'm really happy to be here. And yeah, really great lineup. What I've had the chance to see has been so great, and I'm looking forward to seeing the rest. But yeah, so happy to be here.
Kalpana, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Kalpana, and my film is Tattva. I think it played in the first half of the program. I'm in Buffalo. It's Eastern time here, so I guess it's like, what, 9:30? I'm a filmmaker and artist, and I'm also doing my PhD in media study at the State University at Buffalo. So that's me. Maybe I'll pass it on to someone else. Miranda?
Oh, thank you. I also am on Eastern time. I'm coming to you from Rosendale, New York, although I'm usually based in Los Angeles. And my film was The Wind. It was the one with a few graphite animations in it. Oh, should I pass it on too? That's kind of fun. Let's do Natasha. Why don't you go next?
Okay, hi, I'm Natasha. I'm in Eastern time, and Easter time for some. And I'm in Ithaca, New York, and I teach anthropology and documentary here. And I was just telling Kalpana that I am a solitary and gregarious female, and my film was the last piece, a gregarious species. And I'll pass it to Rian.
Hello, I'm Rian. Thank you once again to the Flaherty for organizing this and inviting me. Right now I'm based in Singapore, and my film is Shell Revolution. I think it was the first one that played in the program. Yeah, looking forward to discussing the film.
I think that just leaves Michael.
Hi, I'm Michael Woods, also go by M Woods. Sorry, it's really late here too. So it's 2:30 in Oxford, England. My film was Bedford Cheese, which appeared near the middle of the program. Just sort of acid trip one, as it was referred to. Oh, sorry, I forgot if there was something else I was supposed to say. But anyway, thank you very much for having me here.
Yeah, thank you all so much. My name is Sunil Sanskari. I'm also a co-programmer based in Brooklyn right now, in my vibey little apartment. Yeah, so we wanted to go ahead and dive into the conversation. We did want this to be as much of a conversation as possible, so feel free to talk about anything you want. It could be about your film, it can be about other people's films, it could be about things that you're thinking about. We're definitely not limiting the conversation. And we would like to address everyone. So whoever feels called to speak at any moment, please feel free to join in and of course respect other filmmakers' times. So the first question was, when watching these works, the programmers kind of had a lot of different thoughts on questions of excess, questions of destruction, questions of waste, but also questions of like interspecies relationships. Does anyone, is there something along these lines that you all feel called to within these questions of excess, waste, destruction, but also interspecies relationships that you find resonant within your works? Or if not, is there something else that you think along those lines that is of interest in that sense? And whoever would like to comment on that, please feel free. Some are more obvious than others. Like there's, for instance, in Bassem's work, there's, literally, there's resonances with Lebanon's waste crisis. There's lots of questions of e-waste. And then there's also questions of, what does destruction mean? When we're in a world where the world is constantly being destroyed, what does that mean for the works that we create? Yeah, feel free, anyone, pick up on these threads.
I'll pick up just so I don't leave you hanging. So I made the film in 2019, and that was 4 years after the waste crisis had began in Beirut, and it began in 2015. And there were the waste revolts, what had been called the waste revolts, with people burning garbage in the streets as a gesture. But then it felt like in those 4 years, nothing had really, no systemic change had taken place. The revolts had been seen as some kind of failure. Nothing had come of it. And so in 2019, I felt like something needed to give. And so when I made the film, I was thinking, I was playing around. I still don't know what I was trying to say with the film, but I think when I used the metaphor of kink or accepting risk, it was somehow saying that something needed to give, and we needed to accept confrontation or accept or acknowledge the violence that was latent or not so latent everywhere. And kind of weirdly enough, at the end of a couple of months later, the uprising happened in 2019. And so I felt there was some kind of anticipation that year. It felt like things were really charged. It felt like and then yeah, that was that year. And it does feel like if I'm going to speak about Beirut, it feels like 2019 had its precursor in 2015 in the waste crisis, in the waste revolts. And then it is funny to think, yes, that was a battle over the environment as a starting point. Even in 2019, those weren't primarily the concerns. But yeah, that's some kind of historical subtext to the film.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think about that, and I also think about Rion's shell revolution in terms of the ways in which something has evolved over time. Kind of has created this evolution or genealogy of branding. And I wonder, Rion, if you might comment on this question of whether you want to call it waste, or whether you want to call it you know, uh, a destruction in terms of the environment, extraction. Yeah, I'm curious to see how you see this piece as it's 1 minute long. It's kind of an incredible 1 minute. How do you see this piece as being related to these questions of excess and destruction or waste?
Oh, thank you for the question. Actually, the piece was made out of a kind of research that I was doing around Shell's relationship or Shell's activities in Singapore. And that was when I was the curator of that particular exhibition I was making this work for. And that exhibition was in the Netherlands. And she kind of pointed me to the evolution of the Shell logo over the years. And it's quite remarkable, the evolution, because it almost parallels the nature of the industry, the evolution of the industry itself. And the interesting thing about Shell is that, originally it was two companies. One was a British company, another one was a Dutch company. And the British company was actually a trading company that dealt in kind of small ornamental trinkets. And one of the things that they sold were, these shells, like physical shells. So that's actually where the image of Shell becomes the logo of what is now this huge oil company. Which is why in the original logos of the very first logo of Shell is actually, the shell is kind of placed flat downwards. So it's almost like and it's depicted as a kind of physical object that you can almost grab and touch. But eventually, as the logo, over the years, the shell would go upright and eventually become a kind of vector graphic form. So almost, for me, I read in this turn of the shell into an upright position and completely flattened out into a kind of vector graphic space, as almost a kind of parallel of this kind of increasing kind of abstraction from nature, that is really the logic of this industry. And of course, with the original kind of shell company was just, collecting, these shells and selling it. So there was one mode of kind of this very simple, in a way, mode of extraction, which is kind of grabbing things. But of course, increasingly, if you think about the oil industry today, we think about the financialization of the oil industry. The abstraction has taken almost a kind of mathematical turn, and it's much more kind of sophisticated in that sense. So I guess for me, the logo became quite a kind of interesting way to access this set of histories.
Yeah, and on that note, the kind of mathematical turn that that has took, I think Alia has a follow-up question to this one.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to hear more from Natasha before we move on to the second question. The work really stands out in so many ways, and I was just wondering if you want to speak a little bit about that and your choice of that particular angle. There are so many works here that use metaphor in different ways. And I think yours definitely does a lot of work there. So do you want to speak a little bit?
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you so much to the three of you for programming these works together and generating these conversations. And absolutely, I was thinking about questions of excess and interspecies relatedness in this piece through the locust as this kind of boundary object that brings together various stakeholders, brings together these farmers, these scientific pest managers, and nationalist kind of politicians around xenophobic migration rhetoric. And excess comes in a few kind of explicit ways. There's this one sequence where the video goes black because of the excess of the visual of the actual beheading of the locust that one of the people in the videos that was circulating commits, and then the kind of excess of the biological phenomenon of the locust swarm as a kind of felt natural phenomenon, and then the excess and destruction of the devastation that the farmers in the video talk about in terms of the crops being, eaten, and then also the kind of excess of the digital video landscape and this proliferation of TikTok videos and WhatsApp videos being circulated. So there were a few ways that I was playing with that question too of the swarm, both kind of thinking of the circulation of digital videos and the kind of the way that there's this work on insect media by Husi Parika that I think is really interesting and talks about the relationality between the individual and these kind of larger aggregates like the swarm. And so the swarm is kind of coterminous with each of the individual locusts. And in the same way, I think TikTok videos are really interesting in their kind of, we may view them individually, but they're kind of part of this sort of referential media ecology. So thanks so much for that generative question.
If it's okay, I would love to just jump over a couple of things that Natasha said and maybe bring in some of our other filmmakers to the conversation. You bring up this idea of media ecology, the studies around the swarm. You're talking about the TikTok landscape, all these different things that about the multiple layers. I think a lot of the, I don't want to remember what I say. A lot of the concepts you bring up, to me as a view, if I was to take myself back, but just as a viewer, Miranda's work, Michael's work, Kalpana's work, there is renaissances, I believe, in those works potentially. I'd be curious to hear from them if they feel like some of the things that you just brought, Natasha, could be of linkage, because I think in various ways, all four, I mean, everyone in this program really, frankly, is dealing with the environment in a way that there is this technological aspect, but then there is also this bio aspect and this biopsychological aspect that I think Natasha's work really directly spearheads by using the locust as a metaphor for so much more than just the locust.
Well, I'll jump in just to answer that. I guess in my film, like what I would relate to the idea of excess as the excess of image, the excess of gaze, even. Because I think what I'm doing in my film is sort of like looking at a technology, which is like an electron microscope, which is, going into like a nanoscape of any object or material or body. And just sort of there's a subtle, I think there's a subtle critique of the scientific gaze and the use of excess of technology. Like, how deep do you want to go into something? How much do you want to see? How much can you know? So it's a sort of it's challenging this, it's sort of like pointing to the redundancy of, this technological advancement that, we think is going to help solve everything. So it's also about like questioning that in relationship to the body and media, where one is looking at the body as a site where these images of excess sort of play out. And, the biological, the ecological, like even these divisions don't help anymore. So I'm sort of, I guess my film just points to the frustration of, reaching the end of the line with this kind of advancement of some kind, or the idea of advancement, if that answers the question. And yes, thank you for bringing these films together. It's really great to be able to see it in this context. I feel very honored. Thanks.
I'll go next. I too feel very honored to be a part of this group, and thank you so much for bringing us all together. And Kalpana, I'm so glad you brought up scale in that kind of discussion of swarm and excess and collectivization and everything we're talking about now. And I do feel like Natasha's film really articulates and spearheads it, and I'm thankful to the curators and Devon for like tying us in specific ways. I think that for me, in a lot of my work in general, maybe even in this film the least, I'm like dedicated to this exact question. Like, I think the biggest kind of concern for me as like a maker is understanding what it means to be a part of all of these things, whether they're global or on the community scale, or even like a backyard scale of a relationship to an ecology of insects. And then given, I feel like, the tools that human beings still have at this like techno evolutionary moment, a lot of this information is still coming through these various sensors, like the sensory experience, which of course has this now like deeply technological adaptation. Everything is sensed through an apparatus of a screen, or not everything, but that's kind of a dominant way of interpreting information now. And I think I'm just trying to keep up, as like a human being, trying to do my best to be a part of the community that is the swarm we're in, global scale. But it's very difficult, right, as a human being to hold a concept of what feels at times like an infinity. And so, I think my piece in particular is almost like a fragment of this moment where you've been like staring at the screen too long, and maybe what you really need to do is just like walk outside and feel the literal wind. But I don't usually mean that in like the strict binary of like technology bad, physical good, or something like that. But it does seem to be like more and more, and regardless of my specific work, like just such a big part of being alive in 2021 and beyond, is understanding like those various media sensory inputs.
I just want to jump in about this technology good, reality bad, because a lot of what we were thinking about as we were putting together this program is like how, reality is just a little bit more, like a lot more complicated than just being, a techno-pessimist and saying that your technology is going to ruin the planet and kill us all. Because, now we know that without these screens, we would have all been probably like locked in like our apartments, not seeing any kind of human being whatsoever. So I was wondering if it is in a way tempting to read a lot of your works at like along those techno-pessimist lenses, but I think it's more complicated. So I was wondering if you want to speak to that. I think Michael, maybe.
Yeah, everything so far has been a really substantive discussion, so thank you very much. I think back on Rian, your work in the way it introduces everything. It shows the flattening that occurs with hyperreality, right? That which is representational to the degree of simulation that then becomes that flattened graphic, and to what extent that then flattens all of consciousness. And I think for instance, in Ecuador, which is where my grandparents live, there's a town called Shell, which is where Shell had an outpost, essentially, right on the edge of the Amazon. And so the map has changed, with this sort of global greedy capitalism. Now that capitalism is funded by nothing, because the nothing is the value of the dollar, but just out of trust. And so, to a lot of degrees, we're operating under apparatuses that are fundamentally nihilistic. And the issue ends up being the way in which the information is transmitted, specifically if it becomes empty chambers or empty boxes of nothing information is constantly circulated in a faster and faster system. We tend to get to that element of chaos that a number of these pieces have addressed, and we've addressed in this conversation. And the things that have been really bothering me recently have been things like the Feigenbaum constant, which is a number of ratio by which systems bifurcate within a population growth algorithm. And it's always 4.669 or thereabout. It averages to that number. And previously too, there was a comment about the I believe it was I forgot who had said it, but my apologies. But regarding sort of like the scientific exactitude, right? That's the Borges thing that Baudrillard brings up as well. But that scientific exactitude is even scarier when we think about the way in which the double slit experiment casts consciousness into doubt, and dark matter and dark energy, black hole singularity are essentially mathematical quandaries. So I think that's like these larger bits of nothingness, but then we work that nothingness in through all these different layers, and we end up with something that's really polluted, to the extent that we risk system death.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for all of that. Devon, there was a question about being in conversation with others. Did you want to
Well,
ask that one, or do you want to pull on another thread?
I was actually going to say Natasha brought up a point in the chat. I was wondering if Natasha wanted to propose that to the group as a next conversation.
One about the glitch.
Yeah.
Because we were also struck by that when we like watched all these films together, and then the streaming was being a bit strange. We were like, perfect, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the works you can't really tell. So yeah.
Yeah, that definitely hit, like, it really hit home in understanding that like these were all experiences in the present moment that were both like, you know, totally messed with your sense of time and intentionality. Did anyone else have any specific feelings about the experience of these works in this particular time-based, screen-based way?
Maybe Miranda, if you have something to say, because you kind of brought up the concept about screen interfaces as the ways that we encounter media. And I'm thinking about how you program the Edison film, and that has this kind of a physical screen in this, behind this digital screen. So that kind of brought some of these questions together for me.
It's funny you lobbed it to me, because I was thinking almost a little bit about your choice to have the vertical format, which of course you tied in, I think, well enough to other kind of media outlets like TikTok and probably other ways of using the phone. I thought it was really interesting the way you layered the two, and I feel like, you know, in this year, a lot of the film festivals I've been going to, it's just, we're like living in our desktops and our phones and whatever, and this like new language of flattened digitization is like, it's funny. It's like, for a second I was like, what do I have to say about this? Because it's become just so much everything all the time. Like immersive to the point of me not knowing what the air is around me. But I thought that moment where you overlapped them was really fascinating, because not only had I not really seen that, and it's so simple, it almost called attention to the flattening. It was like, we have layers of flat. You know, I could talk about like Deleuze's Sheets of the Past, I think it is, where he's talking about these kinds of moments of access in a film, where they're all kind of stacked up. And looks hyped on that. Maybe we should go there. For me, the last thing I'll say about flattening, glitch, etc. I mean, I think there's this concept in this book, The Shallows. It's a little bit of a pop science book, but I love this book. And it's about how our brains are moving like towards understanding information in a big, flat, expansive way, instead of like a deep well of information. We don't have to recall as much, because we can actually just search on Wikipedia anytime we need to know anything. And I see that affecting the aesthetics of these films as well. Did you want to say something about Deleuze? You want to take it there?
That, you know, what's amazing about that is that I part of my dissertation work that I've been doing is looking at Gnosticism and looking at well, Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer, and his relationship with Gnosticism. And the way that he sort of represents the concepts that I understand of in the Deleuze. Now, I haven't read any of that. But the interesting thing is he refers to it as the zebra horse lover fat, which is his like sort of pseudonym for himself, and that he's that now that enters into that long chain of frames that continues infinitely in either direction as himself. But that now state is that intermittent nothing state that's created. But there's something too, also this idea that you were talking about of the broadening of that knowledge, because then too, if you look at like the pre-Socratic philosophers, we're still dealing with the basic fundamental issues of Western philosophy. We haven't gotten past it. It's just like you know, reading Sartre is just going back and thinking about the unbounded, or that which is totally limited, and or that which does not exist. And so that non-entity as a problem in philosophy is it's actually generative. Like Donald Trump is a personification of that non-entity, and there is a destruction generative of that sort of not linguistics, but I guess it's the use of media as a mouthpiece for that sort of nihilism. Sorry to bring up Donald Trump.
This is a question for, I'm directing this to Kalpana and Bassem, but again, really anyone else who wants to jump in also feel to jump in. But like, and you both have spoken to this, but I would be curious to hear more in depth regarding this, is the aspect of materiality in your work, being related to the questions and the concepts you're raising and exploring. Like, how do you see those relations between the material nature and the concepts and ideology? I don't want to say ideology because that's a loaded term, but I guess the concepts and themes of your work.
And just following up on that from the comments we have, and oh yes, would love to hear from Bassem and Kalpana too on digital transcendence in their works.
Bassem, you want to go first?
Sure. Yes, thank you, Natasha, for bringing that up. When I was making the work, I had, I think, some very local concerns in relation to the political situation in Beirut, but I was also trying to look at discourses of resilience and how resilience is obviously, I think in the last 2-3 years, there's been like a lot of counter discourses on how this term is used, on how resilience is mainly at the level of psychology, how it's used, and how especially what became popular or what became more, people grew more conscious of, is this idea that maybe like marginalized communities or people of color are expected to have some kind of resilience in the face of systemic abuses. But I was also researching how the term evolved from ecology, and how systems are expected to be resilient when we normalize, or when we reify a condition of crisis, or when we accept that crisis is constantly recurring, and therefore the entities that must survive need to be resilient, rather than be able to envision change or progress or improvement. These entities just need to accept that they need to be resilient, and they need to manage crisis. And so in the film, what I was trying to say is that, like, I think in terms of materiality, it's all filmed in a landfill, and this is one of the landfills that opened up provisionally in Beirut, like as a makeshift. Like, it was very toxic to the nearby area. It was dumping waste directly into the Mediterranean, and the waste ended up in Cyprus. Like, it was a major catastrophe. And yet, like, we were not allowed to be there. So like, we weren't legally allowed to film there, and we kept getting kicked out. Every time I would try to film there, we would get kicked out. But I said I didn't want to show the trash like throughout the film. I only wanted it to be there in specific moments. But yeah, like, in terms of materiality, I was trying to work with like this, in one shot at least, you see the garbage, and then it morphs into this kind of more liquid form. So I was trying to play around with that, and I feel like, yeah, like, I think a lot from the works that I've seen, I feel like it's the most interesting when or like it's one way of generating image or cinematic image when you shoot a texture, but then it's also modulated through some kind of synthetic image processing like decision. And I feel like, yeah, like a lot of the works kind of have that, whether it's through layering of different frames or whether it's through some kind of image processing formal decision. But yeah, that's I think how I would reply to that. Kalpana, do you let us know how you went about it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think thanks for sharing a bit about your process, because actually thinking about processing images is actually also where I'm at with this, like I feel like there's a need almost to engage with the materials around, but to sort of process them in ways that make sense to us in terms of how we feel, connect, or engage with it, and like to sort of go beyond the linguistic or the symbolic, and just to sort of like really get to the feeling aspect, which is what your whole program is sort of talking about, to feel more, right? So how do we sense, feel, inhale, exhale, breathe media? And this is sort of where my work comes from. Like my research has been on breath poetics in cinema, and I'm looking at how have we ignored breath, as an aesthetic. Like we've talked about light, sound, haptics, everything, but how did we forget that, if you want to conceive of cinema as live, sentient, embodied, like, does it breathe? And why have we not thought of breath? And today we're all thinking about breath in terms of like, who gets to breathe, and like the respiratory condition of our interspecies is sort of more evident now, like post-pandemic. And so I guess I wasn't thinking about all this when I made the film, but at some level, like these are the questions that I keep coming back to all the time. Like, why do we even have media? Like, it's at some point, like this excess, do we really need it unless we're processing it through us and with others in some sort of a meaningful way, where we actually are able to work with the material of it and sort of transcend it to another level, or to go beyond that material aspect to something that can maybe create a kind of a collective consciousness. I don't really want to subscribe to that as a sort of culty spiritual thing, but I'm just saying, like, how can we use media to shift our consciousness in ways that allow us to connect better in terms of like just a more socially just and ecologically sort of positive kind of direction, I guess. So in my film, I'm actually just working very closely with materials, like everyday objects I find around me, and putting them, studying them with this electron microscope to sort of see what landscapes they reveal, and then projecting those images onto the walls of my house, or the or the body itself, and the skin, just to see like how can we process these images, take them through us, like completely twist them and bend them out of shape, so that by the time we're done with processing this material, can we please go to the next level where we think about image differently or media differently. So that's sort of coming. It's probably too much of a philosophical approach, but that's where I'm coming from. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was brilliant. This conversation has been amazing. We have about like 10 minutes left, which is crazy. It's flown by. Alia, you wanted to say something?
I just want to, because Michael has a question from the audience. So we have a question asking Michael, really curious on your process creating along these themes of simulation and digital transcendence in your film. Aiden sent that. So Michael, do you want to respond to that?
What Kalpana just said was pretty amazing too. And I guess I am a subscriber that there's an evolution of consciousness that's possible, that for largely my life is sparked through art. As a early drug addict, and then also media addict, and having learned a lot of my consciousness, my persona, I say, from media sources. I I'm a Latino and I pass as white as well. And so there's so many different layers of crises in terms of who one is. And so had I not had certain formative experiences in high school that flipped my consciousness, I'll try to explain this really quickly for time's sake. But I think that people are in bad faith, which Sartre defines, or at least defines as being that which you are not, or vice versa, right? So when we try to convince ourselves that this isn't real, which I think a lot of people are unconsciously or consciously in this state of mind, eventually that thought, the speed of that thought can induce a sort of psychosis. And that psychosis can become societal. To put people in good faith, you have to take media and place it in good faith. To do so, media has to recognize that it's in bad faith. What we film is not reality, it's not real. It's a falsehood from the moment that we capture it. But because we rely upon a system of signs that are broken in this way and continue to break, we have to take the media and reflect back on itself, potentially to expose a lot of the nastiness that's inside of it. But that's the quality, I think, in media representation, that one can actually use the media against itself, and to create a sort of transcendental experience within the media to form a media consciousness. Our media has consciousness, and that's the other bizarre and scary part of what we're doing. It's the motion picture has a input and output just like us.
Yeah, absolutely. That brings up so many points, and I actually just want to go back to a few things just to connect what you just said, Michael, with Kalpana. This idea of the breath, the prana, right? This idea of this life force that exists with all beings. Not to get too into Hinduism, which I very much do not subscribe to. But there's this question of time built into that, because within the prana you have this, supposedly the breath, one full breath is 4 seconds long. And that was one moment, back when thousands of years ago, when people used to keep time and they kept time with only the breath. It was one moment, what we consider 1 second now was technically 4 seconds, because it was one full breath. So I'm interested in how this illusion of time plays out within these works. And I want to bring it back to Rohan as well, with what Michael was saying in terms of this kind of this life of the or skin. Literally, in the case of Rohan, I want to say the skin of in this instance, the corporation's use of a facsimile, or the simulacra of a shell, which it was at one point potentially based on, this thing that has a life, this thing that is an organic experience and being. And Rohan, I wonder if you might just be able to briefly touch on this question of time. And also, your work is very expansive. I don't know how many people are familiar with Rohan's work, but you do performative lectures. A lot of your work is about capitalism. A lot of your work is about many, many different subjects. But I was wondering if you'd be, oh, that's our timer. If you would be interested in talking a little bit about your relationship to time and capitalism in this work specifically, but you could also talk about your work in general. You're muted.
That's a big question.
It's a huge question. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, actually, this is probably the shortest work I've ever made, because it's just like a 1 minute, and it's almost like I mean, when I made it, I usually showed it in an exhibition context, but maybe within the last 2 years, it's been shown in kind of screening programs, and it's almost always the first work that is being in the program, because it feels like a sponsor's advertisement or something. Like Shell kind of appears at the beginning of the program, which kind of is interesting now that you within a kind of cinema program context, which is something I didn't expect. So I'm not sure if that's a good or bad thing, but yeah, but but it also does somehow link to the idea of kind of arts patronage of these major corporations. But I mean, back to the question of time, I think for me, like this piece is really about this condensation of this really long history within this 1 minute plus cycle. But also I think to bring up there's the logo in the front that is spinning around, but in the background is actually is a film made by Shell, because and Shell interestingly, you know, they had a very active documentary unit, and in fact that's where you can see the whole industrial media complex come together, because many of the formative documentary filmmakers were funded by Shell to go all over the world to make documentaries. And that image from the back is from a documentary of Shell called Shellorama. And that was used to, and Shellorama was projected on this kind of a panoramic screen that was invented around that time. And so that whole film is supposed to be this completely immersive experience. And that film actually shows how it was meant to show how oil travels, which is interesting, you know, given the recent context of the Suez Canal, and suddenly all these global flows are visualized. But the work of visualizing these global flows were, they commissioned these documentary filmmakers to help companies like Shell to communicate how these flows were being, how these flows worked globally, you know. And so in the film, you actually see the oil coming out of the Niger Delta, and then it eventually lands and enters the petrol pump in a petrol station into a car. So that was interesting, because actually that in those documentaries, there's no time. It's really about space rather than time, because things just flow and things are just moving all the time. So I think, it's kind of interesting that relationship to documentary, and like for so many of us, like in the work that we presented today, actually that temporal dimension is very, very important, and I feel like that almost is a kind of resistance towards this kind of endless kind of spatialization of everything, and we kind of feel that especially in the kind of flatness of the digital mediation that we are subjected to today.
That was great. I had no idea that Shell sponsored so many early documentary practices, and I feel like that's just such a. I'm going to be sitting with that for a little bit. We probably have like time for one more question. Is that okay? I think no. I don't know. It depends on. Okay, cool. We got the thumbs up. Alia or Devon, did you want to take us out with one last question?
No, I just wanted to say something about petro cinema being a thing.
Yeah.
So let's just all like spend some time researching that. There's a really cool curator called Mona Damlouji who programs a lot of stuff around oil and cinema, and that's everywhere. So thank you for bringing that up.
Devon, any last thoughts from you?
Nope, it's been a great conversation and really great to see old faces and some new faces.
Yeah. Seriously, thank all of you again, and thanks to the Flaherty. We really appreciate you staying up late or joining us very early. And hopefully you get to see some of the works tomorrow as well. And for anyone who's still with us right now, please join us tomorrow for program 2, in which we'll also have another Q&A session, and hopefully just as an incredible of a conversation. So thank you all so much again for your incredible works and for joining us today.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.